that was taken out. Now the big issue with restoring is we want them to function as windows. Whether they get opened again or not, the big issue is, are they going to actually work as windows? So we need to clean out the edges. What's happened with a lot of properties of this vintage is that they've been painted poorly. So essentially, layers and layers of paint was probably what they thought was going to protect it. It did in a way, but the problem with more paint is that it actually fills all the edges up, which means everything gets thicker. Now, we've got examples on this place that we think there's probably, I probably think between 8 and 12 coats of paint. And it's not so much, it doesn't matter so much on the flat surface, it's what we call the fat edge. And the fat edge is where you have layers of paint that just naturally builds up because the brush hits that and basically puts a double layer of paint on every time. Then we can't open the windows. And then this window, for example, hasn't been open for 20 years. So it was painted shut. Clearly it's on the ground floor, so it wasn't used for fresh air. But really they didn't really care whether it opened or not. So what we've done is we've removed the complete window. And beautiful, it's quite beautiful actually, because to get in behind all of this and clean all these edges out, I'm just hoping we make that up. We've gone through and cleaned all the inside rebates out, which means that they do open now. We've cleaned the hinges out.
So what kind of tools would you use for that? Would you use a sort of heat gun paint stripper, or?
We have to be really careful.
Yeah.
The issue is lead. Lead is something that faces up on these old buildings. So we have to encapsulate it, essentially. So we use dustless sanding systems. Where we do have to scrape, we do use a heat gun, and we contain it, and then we actually remove it in a safe manner. But the big thing is that what's really been a game changer is probably the dustless sanding systems. What that enables us to do is to physically sand, and all of the dust that's taken off actually goes into a HEPA filter, through a HEPA filter, and then into a bag, and then we can dispose of it. This is a community, it's an open area, so we need to contain it, and we all know the dangers of lead.
So that would be one of the benefits for a homeowner using a professional and a recommended professional, is that they can deal with those health and safety issues.
It really is, and I suppose that if Australia certainly has documentation of what the damage of lead does just in mining it, for example. Port Pirie in South Australia is a great example of what lead can do. But if you extend that into the building side of things, lead was dropped out of paint manufacturing probably in the early 70s. The last examples were probably some white lead that was in the undercoats and the primers. But prior to that, lead was actually one of those amazing products that actually was used in a raw material fashion for paint. And for those that love the manufacturing of paints, it was very important right through the process when paints were developed. Prior to the shellacs and stuff were obviously before then. To cut a long story short, homeowners really should be concerned about what lead can do, particularly if you've got young children. That's the thing that worries me endlessly, what just a little bit of lead can do to a young child, and their ability to learn later in life. So
basically it's not just listed properties, it's any properties, prior to 1975.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And look, I don't want to frighten people about it, but there are systems that can be used, and there's equipment that can be used, and there's skilled professionals that can be used. So it's not a question of, if you are going to do that, renovate yourself, you need to take as much due care as what the professional does.
So you've got the preparation on at the moment, and obviously you do this in consultation with State Heritage, because it is State Heritage listed building. What kind of preparation do you use before you do the top coats?
Well, the top coat, what we're trying to do is, and what I love about the process of heritage is that what we're trying to do is preserve. I believe that we're preserving something for the next generation, and what I'm hoping is that the processes that we're using will allow the next painter in 50 years' time to perhaps prepare something the same way we are, and they'll see the beauty of what was built 200 years ago at that stage. So what we use as a system, we get the this is probably something that's coming up quite odd, but you'll see a product on here.
Oh,
which is called,
okay.
It's called Seal and Peel.
Yeah.
All right, that's the commercial name. Essentially, it's a liquid mask.
Right.
And what we do is we prepare everything, but we paint this on to the putty line, and we remove that once we put the final coat on.
Yeah.
But what it does is it protects that glass in the process, so that it won't. If there may be a slight crack in it, it will hold that stress. It allows us to cut the film off at the end once we've gone through the full colour process, but we've used an oil-based undercoat. And the reason we use an oil-based undercoat is that it's a solid binder. It'll bind up the wood and the putty. It will stop some tannin bleed, but it also allows us to give it a nice sand between coats.
Yeah.
Now, traditionally, these properties were done in oil-based enamels. What we're doing is we're slightly changing the system, so we're looking at longevity. So the reason we're using an oil-based undercoat of this type, and this is a product from Dulux called One Step, it's what we call a bridging undercoat, which means that this will adhere to the existing coats, so it won't delaminate. And then we're in a situation where we can put our water-based paint system on. We're going to use an aqua enamel, so it has the same properties of an enamel, but it's wash up in water. But the beautiful part about the water-based enamels is that they have flexibility in them. So what we're after, particularly where we've got sections that are exposed to the weather, we want that paint to move a little bit, and that'll be the best investment that the trust will have, is that they won't have to continually maintain property, but they'll have a paint that will actually move with the substrate.
Yeah. So you've chosen to go for a, say, semi-gloss instead of a high gloss. Can you tell me the reasons for that?
Well, I suppose there's always that people often ask what is the gloss level. So if you start at two ends of the spectrum, you've obviously got flat at one end, and then you've got high gloss at the other, like up to 90% gloss level. The reason we want to use the Dulux system is that we know that the semi-gloss sits in around 30 to 35% gloss level, and their gloss will sit up around 65. But what we find, this is a nice marriage between gloss levels, because what gloss does is that it cleans well, because a natural, if you, let's say a sheet of glass, you threw some water on it, a lot of what lands on it's going to clean itself. It's self-cleaning. But the lower you go into the gloss, so the semi-gloss, it's less imperfections. High gloss will show every bump and bruise.
Yeah.
The semi-gloss will show less, but it will still have a similar quality, unless you're looking at it under full light. So if you look at full light, it's called shearing light. So gloss levels are determined not by a direct light over the top, but how much light is coming off at 45 degrees, and that'll give you the bounce of light.
Yeah.
So what semi-gloss, when you look at a semi-gloss, particularly this one, other brands are different, but what we're finding this one works for us.
Yeah, that's great. So just maybe some final tips on paint, because I guess with paint, why do we paint timber? What's the reason we use it?
Oh, look, essentially it's a film and it protects. And I think that's the beautiful part of. Actually, why do we paint? It's a good question, because I think we paint because we like colour. I think we're naturally attracted to colour, and we can look at the history of paints and and how they were made. But to me, it's like art that you look, a picture. If you looked at the history of painting, the race to be the best was actually who could achieve the most vibrant colours also, because colours actually were a sign of wealth, actually. Yeah. Which is quite interesting. And I believe that architecture was the same. I think we produced paints, and if you look at commercial volumes of paint, I think paint was made because they had the punter had an appetite for, we need to protect our house. And let's be honest, wealthy people had the houses. The working class really was a sheet of iron if they were lucky. But people that had money wanted to protect it. And if you look at the history of paints, the brighter and more vibrant the paints really haven't happened until probably after the turn of the century. Well, not the one that's just gone, the one prior.
Mm-hmm.
And that came with pigments and amongst other things. But that also came with art too. So if you look at the way art changed and colours became more vibrant, the reproduction of colour was there. So why are we going to paint in the colours that we're going to be using? We're going to use a colour similar to this. Now, this is pretty much as close as we're going to get in terms of a colour that's going to appeal to the building. And I think that's why often a lot of the colours that we are used with trust work might be dull, might look boring to someone, but that's actually what was manufactured at the time.
Yeah.
That's what was commercially available, and that's why we're doing it in the colour schemes that we're using.
Yeah, brilliant. Oh, thank you very much for your detailed explanation.